We are kicking off our last technical session here. We've got Dan Muller, who's a PE in Texas with decades of experience at the intersection of water resources, engineering, and produced water reuse. And so anytime Dan comes to town, we always love to go have a beer at Bosque, and I'm always surprised at how much we kind of see eye to eye and think about things the same way. And so I'm really interested to see what you have to present, Dan, because, yeah, again, we think pretty similarly, and I know you're at least the name conventionally kind of on one side of the aisle, but no, I think we really need your perspective and everybody else's perspective to kind of round out the discussion on produced water. So
perfect, Zach. Appreciate that. Yeah. So I've been working in the produced water space for like 10, 11 years, and on the advocacy side, and working with EDF, Environmental Defense Fund. And that effort, an EDF's effort, is to look at science and technology and inform policy based upon that. And moving toward asking informed questions, but moving toward what answers we can come from those informed answers. And we continue that so I've been involved with the consortium, the New Mexico Consortium, since it began. And there's been a lot of progress made. Really has been quite a bit of progress made. What I'm going to focus on today is kind of looking at demonstrating feasibility, because we're kind of moving now into that arena where a lot of science has been done. We're starting to scale this up. We're talking about potential permits in Texas. So what is the feasibility and what does that mean and where do we stand on that? So first off, start with some basic stuff. We understand there's drivers for beneficial reuse. And so we realize that there's a need, and there's a driver to do this. Number one is that, of course, water is a big deal. And especially in water stress areas, and that coincides much with the oil and gas production. So produced water is right in that arena. We've heard and talked about how disposal zones for SWDs are pressuring up. That affects potentially the cost for disposal, also affects the ability, maybe limits to the disposal. So, and failures and blowouts of some wells, hearing about that. Okay, there's drivers there to be considering what to do with this water besides what has been done with it for quite some time. Still, the majority of the water is still disposed to SWDs, but there's a driver for that. And there's potential, environmental benefits. There really is. Maybe we could use this water for something. If it's treated properly, do we know enough about it, we could use it for something else. So there's the drivers. There's challenges. Well, number one, this is a relatively new waste stream. I know we've all been looking at this for a number of years, but tell you what, we've been looking at other industrial waste streams a lot longer than this. And it took a while to get comfortable with those other waste streams. This is in the process of that. And so it's a highly complex, one of the most complex industrial waste streams, I would say, that we are trying to work with. There are contaminants of concern. There's also technology developing and vetting that makes it a challenge. We also need to understand what the viable beneficial reuse and options are. We know there's some ideas about them, but what are those options? What are the viable options? And then, of course, developing a regulatory program to work with that. So these are challenges that we've been working on through this collaborative effort with the consortiums and with industry and academia and such to get to that point. Whenever I give this talk, still do the low-hanging fruit. We'll hit this really quick. This is not beneficial reuse. This is recycle, maximize recycle. We've been talking about that. Maximizing recycles lessens the disposal volumes and demands on other resources, but also realize there's limitations of that. So there you still will have that driver for needing to do something else with this water if we can truly determine what can be done and properly done with that. So when we talk about the feasibility, feasibility is not just one thing, it's multiple parts to the feasibility. Number one is the technical feasibility. Technically, can we do this? The engineering and the science. And a lot of work has been done with that. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but what I really will focus on, well, the economic feasibility. And that's the process you take. You don't jump into the economics and say, well, what is all this truly all going to cost? Until you get a pretty good feel for what technology is going to be used or what types of technology will be used and what are the disposal options and such. So this is the process that you go through. And I'll talk more about here about looking at this economic feasibility. I will add a third item here. And this is like user and public acceptance. And Pay and I were just having this conversation, and I'm not a PR person, I'm an engineer. I think, my opinion, that with transparency and looking at the data and having this true honest conversation about technical feasibility and economic feasibility, you will win the day with user and public acceptance, because then they'll get comfortable with that. Now, that's my opinion. Recognize that there are some hurdles with that, but that's how I throw that in there, is that's really part of the feasibility process. Because if you go through everything else, but nobody wants this water, or no one feels comfortable with this water, well then, what have you done it for? So that's my take on that. So to hit technical feasibility, and I put a lot of words on this slide that I really didn't really need to, because I really break it down into three main parts of the technical feasibility, right? Is that, do we know enough about this produced water characterization to inform what processes, technical process, treatment processes would be needed and used, and what kind of effluent quality targets? That's really what that first bullet is. Then how about the treatment technologies? Have we vetted the treatment technologies properly, sufficiently to know, what are the capabilities, what are the limitations? Now talk about these processes can consistently and reliably treat this, because you roll out into the field, a lot of obstacles come into play. It needs to be reliable treatment processes. And then do we have a really sufficient understanding of the environmental impacts of potentially when it releases? Do we know what the limitations are, what the needs are, such as that? So that's the technical feasibility. And a lot of work has been done on all of those parts. Economic feasibility, this is where I'm going to talk a little bit more about. That is a really tough thing to really look into, because there's so much that ties into that, but it's so important when we talk about economics that we talk about all the economic factors that play into this. Moving water around is not cheap. So where it comes from, if you're going to beneficially use it, if you just discharge it, it's right there. If you're going to transport it again, what are all those costs? What are the capital costs? These plants are not going to be cheap to build. Operation and maintenance costs, including labor, because the treatment technologies are not simple. And so there's going to be pretty, robust, I would say, operation and maintenance costs, and also labor costs associated with it. It's going to be a fairly skilled labor needed to run these plants, again, to utilize the technology that is needed. You got to manage the waste streams, and so those waste streams are being generated. How are those managed? Talk a little more about that. And then there's the whole idea about the power requirements. Talking about just available power generation, because a lot of these technologies are very power intensive. Now, we heard some talks this morning about, well, there's ways to maybe minimize that with new technologies, and that's great. Now, that hasn't been rolled out into the field yet, but still, don't stop thinking about it and working on it. It's really important to do that. But still look at the power requirements. It's going to be pretty significant to desal this water at scale. So again, something to be on the table so that we honestly look at that to see what the economic feasibility is. So demonstrated technical feasibility. I just want to kind of go through this. Produced water characterization, knowns and unknowns. A lot of progress has been made. Ryan talked about that a little earlier today. He talked about the number of papers that are the peer-reviewed papers that just the consortium has posted among others. I would say, yes, a lot of progress has been made around that. Toxicity information. Progress is being made. Lots of progress has been made, continues to be made with research at New Mexico State, with research with Texas Tech, with other researchers around the country. Progress has been made on that. Analytical methods. There's a question earlier on, when we first started this, is like, well, will there be a need for new approved analytical methods? That hasn't been talked about a whole lot. I'm not sure. I put a question mark there. Maybe we don't need them. Maybe we have enough analytical methods. Maybe we need to develop some. But I just put that a question mark that's something to be looked at. Now, treatment process vetting. Pilot testing, lab scale testing, great. There's work has been done on that. There's been some really good papers have been published on that, great. Limited size, duration field testing, progress made. But here's where I'm really going to want to focus in on. Scaled, longer term field testing, I'm saying limited progress. And I'm coming from the perspective, when I say limited progress, is that information that, as the public, I have access to. Now, there's very likely data. I think, though, I'd say not very likely. I'm pretty confident there's data out there that's being collected. But until it's publicly released, I really have to stand up here and say, well, I haven't seen it. So what can I say about it? So I'm going to say limited progress. This is an area I really like to see focus on as we talk about larger scale pilots and sharing the data about those pilots. So I looked at the consortium website. Congratulations on this. I think this website work has been fantastic. So I just did a quick snapshot of the pilot studies that are posted on the website, and those are pretty dated. I think there's a great process that was going on back in the 22 and such, where there were reports were generated about pilots, and they were looked at through technical groups. Now, I understand there's some reasoning why that just didn't continue, but the reports that are available, and this is what's available for the public to look at, that's what it is. And those are pretty limited. Those are limited scale pilots, but there was data shared and put on the website, and that's great. So some questions then also come up. I was like, well, when you talk about a scaled pilot, what's some guidance to that? And I would say, well, number one, from a standpoint of technology, it depends upon the technology being used about what is a scaled up pilot run at a sufficient duration. But a guideline for duration is I look back at an EPA document that's been out there looking at, in fact, it's titled Vetting Treatment Technologies. This was written not about oil and gas. This was written about any wastewater treatment technology. So it kind of gives you a feel. It's a really good document. Goes through a lot of details on designing a pilot to vet the technology. Excuse me. So pulling from that, one part of that, for non-biological systems like what we're talking about here, a minimum guidance is basically 3 months. Run the thing for 3 months with no more than 9 days of downtime. And if you look at the document in detail, it says if you surpass that, you reset the pilot and do it again. Now, this is just a minimum guidance. This is not saying that, well, I've done it for 3 months, I'm done. But this gives you an idea that we need to run these pilots for a sufficient amount of time to get a feel that the technology is truly being vetted, is operating as designed. Now, this is about vetting the technology, not vetting the economics. So that's another whole animal. Likely would take longer to do that. But this, again, kind of gives you a guidance on it. So when I talk about like the weak link here is that the data on the scaled in pilot testing has not been publicly shared. And I see people give presentations over time. I go to many conferences and meetings, and there'll be numbers thrown out there that, well, the technology is doing this now at $2 a barrel or $2.50 a barrel. It's like, okay, that's on a PowerPoint, but I don't see the data that backs that up. So I really can't comment on that. All I can just say is that, well, I heard you say it, but what does that really mean? Is that truly all-in cost? We went through that long list. All-in cost is pretty long. And so does that include all-in cost? Does it include, power requirements and such as that in the field testing? And some of this cost data is based upon what I would say are simulations and modeling. Now, that's useful. I would say that is a useful tool to use. A lot of my background is in groundwater modeling, contaminant transport modeling, such as that. I'm well aware of models, but we field verify models. Models give us an idea, but we always have to go back and we need to field verify that. So when I see cost data and we talk about they're based upon simulations, I'm saying, okay, it's good. I'm saying that's useful information, but that's not the same as in the field testing for a sufficient amount of time. That's important to have. So again, let's go to the website to take a couple examples. So for my review of what's been posted on the consortium website, there are a couple of papers that actually talk about economics. And one is entitled Economic Feasibility, and it's a good paper. It talks about different background that gives the background of the cost and such. It actually gives some call outs and talks about hypersaline. And I'm saying it's a good paper. Don't get me wrong, but if you look at the citations, it's modeling, it's simulations, it's what comes up with those numbers. Again, useful, but it's simulations. It's not based upon Permian Basin scaled up pilot studies. So we do have to take that as a point when we start discussing about the true feasibility. Another paper, and it does say specifically about pretreatment, but still it talks about modeling framework for technical economic. And actually, this is a really good paper too. It goes into a lot of detail on power requirements and such. Really a good paper on looking at the economics of again, focusing on the pretreatment, but that's good, gives you an idea. But I pulled this quote here out of the conclusions right there. Additional pilot scale testing and field studies should be prioritized to validate model predictions. That's exactly right. And that's kind of where I'm saying that we're kind of hitting that point now, that from my standpoint, being kind of representing of the public, wanting to ask informed questions to move us toward solutions, this is the kind of information that needs to be the next step. I would say that needs to be done. And I just want to give you a quick comparison, or just kind of a summary of kind of my thought process when I hear someone say, well, here's the cost for treatment. Well, roughly for disposal wells, I put $1 to $1.50. Large, you had around that number. It could be under $1, but okay, it's around that number. Well, let's start kind of compare that and say, well, how does that compare to robustly treating produced water? Now you're looking at multiple steps. You've got a pretreatment more than likely. You've got a desal, which now you've got roughly 50% of recovery. So 50% of your flow goes to the waste stream. Now, research and work is being done to change that, to have maybe less, more recovery on the distillate side, but let's just say 50-50. I think Ryan even quoted that number earlier today. Then that other 50% goes to a polishing step. Then it either goes to discharge or some sort of use. I just listed 3. There's multiple ones, but that's just, so when I'm looking at costs and someone says, well, we think we could treat this for X dollars a barrel, my mind goes, well, what are we talking about? Because if I'm seeing here, I've got 3 phases of work here of treatment that is going to be some sort of dollars per barrel. The waste stream is going to be the same price as disposing of it in disposal well right now. Now, I understand where someone kind of raises their hand and say, well, wait, there's value in that waste stream. Potentially, there's value. There's research being done. Ryan mentioned it too, but I don't think they're going that in their plant right now. I may be wrong with that, but most plants still are going to take that waste stream to a disposal well. So you're already having 50% of your flow. In my mind, thinking about this, 50% of your flow is still at $1 or $1.50. So how can that entire process somehow be $1 to $2? Again, data. If I have the data, then great. We can look at, this is just an example as we talk through this, that when numbers are, put forth, what we think we're to the point that we could treat at X dollars a barrel, that you're talking about all-in costs. So we're comparing apples to apples, not cherry picking out one or the other. And the only way you do that is actually, provide the data. So why is economic feasibility important? There are examples of facilities that the economics model didn't work and they shut down. Now, I think Ryan is not here. I wanted to highlight that NGL is not on this list. I think NGL, you mentioned this morning that they had a plant and the economic model didn't work and they closed it. Well, NGL does things right. They're not on the list, that they didn't have, they closed it the right way. But there's examples of facilities that have not closed it the right way with legacy issues. That is what invariably happens. And then someone is left to clean that mess up because the economic model didn't work. And you cut corners trying to make it work, and you have legacy issues. So we have examples in the produced water world, including Eureka Resources, which discharged into the Susquehanna River. They're in Pennsylvania. I worked with them in a collaborative work early on with EDF. They discharged into the Susquehanna River. They had 1,000-to-1 dilution in that Susquehanna River, so there's not a Susquehanna in the Permian Basin anywhere. So that's a whole different process model they worked with, but their facilities are now closed and they have legacy issues associated with them. So it just happens. So that's why, not saying everyone is going to do that, but that's why there's a concern there that the economics really work. And the way we really determine that is by just getting the data on the table and evaluating it. So make a few final points. Continue the science. You'll fill in some gaps. There's still some work on characterization and toxicity. Some really good work is being done in the consortiums, as well as with industry led research, looking at beneficial uses, how that works. Continue that science. Continue to test treatment process. Continue to look at cutting edge processes to see how they work and move them from pilot to bench, from lab to bench on up, and continue that work. That's great. That's really what's to be done. From my perspective, expand the pilot testing that show promise in achieving high quality effluents, which again, and Mike, you talked about the pilots. There are pilots out there, and that's great. But we go down to this, looking at developing the costs around that. What is the economic cost around that, and sharing that data? And that's what I leave. The last one is that share the data. Recognizing there's a point that, how to do that, but until we get to that point of sharing the data, we're still going to be kind of talking back and forth about, well, will this work? Will it not? How will it work? And I would just leave you as the last, the final thing is that, I'm really not interested in debating this. What I'm really interested in is having an informed conversation. I don't like debates. I just want to sit down and just talk about informed on both sides. How is this working, and how does it, what do we know? What you don't know? And, what's reasonable? And that's what I'm looking for. So that's it. Thank you.
So you push a lot on economics, but I didn't see in your list economics of risk management or economics of avoided costs.
Okay.
Those can be huge.
Yeah.
For a company. So I think your example does not include insurance with risk insurance or avoided costs. I think those are an area that could make treatment, even if it doesn't look cost effective from an engineering standpoint, from an avoided cost standpoint, from a risk management standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. So I think we got to be very careful on the economic side.
Right.
And then on the treatment side, if you want pilot testing, larger scale, we've got to have a way with the regulatory agencies to get to large scale tests. But if we can't do large scale tests because there's no regulations, we've got some issues. So, we need to identify what those scales need to be. 10,000, 1,000 barrels a day, 10,000 barrels a day, and get permits for those things that allow us to do that. If we don't do that, then we're stuck. We'll never get to answer your question. And so we'll be here 10 years from now saying the same thing. How about some pilot scale test data?
Yeah. Yeah.
We can't continue.
You're right.
We've been doing it for 6 years. We've had the same issues, and we haven't addressed those yet. We need to get the people in the room that can address those, or we'll still be here in 10 years from now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I say yes, and I agree with the right. There's lots of different perspectives, different factors in there to look at those costs. And now, I don't think we've been spending 10 years spinning our wheels. I don't think 10 years ago we were at the point that we were comfortable in scaling up a process. I think now we are. And I agree with what Ryan said this morning, that I think we're on the cusp of really at that point, right, within a year or so, or maybe that now, because let's face it, now from what I understand, there's some scaled up pilots going on, pretty good scaled up pilots have been going on for quite some time. But to say that, until I see the data that and how that share, I still have to sit here and say, well, you know, you're telling me that you can do this at X dollars a barrel, but and that's why I want to have, again, not a debate, but just a informed conversation.
So while you're getting that situated, Dan, I really love the presentation, and I think you have a really great framework laid out in your critiques of what we can be doing at the consortium better. And so where's the data? I hear that a lot, and then this is why Dr. Shu and I are wanting to put this data tab on the research page to consolidate all of this.
Right.
Also, you know, we've consolidated the working groups into this T2D, or technology to deployment working group, and you know, TEA is a really big part of that. And so I hope to share, or we hope to share, some of that in the coming months. But you know, we've got great conventional costs from consulting firms, right? As built data for clarifiers, right? Pipelines, et cetera, that are helping to inform that TEA. But it's a very similar framework to what you have laid out of, like, you just, you need to account for all the costs, right? Disposal of the solids. And I think there are actually some challenges there in terms of the infrastructure of, if you start doing large scale produced water treatment, are there enough solids disposal facilities to accept the amount of sludge or solids that might be coming from all the pre-treatment that could be happening? So that's a guess. I don't know if that's for sure, but you know, things like this we need to be considerate of, or be considering, along with workforce development as well. All right, time for one more question. Anybody else? Oh, Rick.
All right. I just wanted to add one more piece to that, because when you talk about, we're starting to see some larger scale pilots put together, and we are, but they're not what I would call a functional pilot. They're a functional pilot, meaning we've got a lot of companies that are running pilots that are producing 400 and 500 barrels of distillate a day, which is getting closer to what we know is an actual type process. But we need a 10,000 barrel a day distillate pilot to say that is a commercial scale, that we're confident that anything past that's going to match what that is. And I want to point this out. That's the part we keep living out, that industry has got to have some surety that we're going to have a place to go with that distillate once we invest that $10 million plus to build that unit. So for us to build it, and for us to build it right now in New Mexico, it's not going to happen, because it's uncertain as to if we're ever going to have a discharge opportunity or a land application opportunity for this distillate coming off this produced water. Texas looks like they're going to give us that opportunity. So that's where you'll probably see the first set of units going over there. But we would have to know that, and that's why we lean on the EPA, right? Because that's what industry says. Industry says, give us a set of ELGs that we have to meet. And once we know we can meet that, then we feel fairly certain we can get a permit for land application or discharge. Once we do that, then we can get the money flowing into these projects to start building these at larger scale.
I think that's a super important point, and Dan and I were actually talking about that right before he went up. Of, you know, if you don't have the regs, maybe it prevents the pilots from even happening, right? Even though you could start the kind of smaller pilot scale that has no discharge, right? And you can manage that. But if you don't have that assurance, like Rick is talking about, people are not incentivized to come in and even build that first stage pilot. So you can't collect the data. So you kind of get stuck in that death loop. And so I don't know what
but you also balance, and we talked about the other side of that, is you balance the fact that if you move too quickly and you go ahead and say, well, we think this will work, and even if it's a smaller scale commercial facility, but then it operates and it doesn't work, what's the cost of cleaning that up, right? And so, again, it's not if this was easy, we wouldn't have been talking about it right? So I recognize that. But you do have to, you know, step back. And I think this is where the consortiums, both Texas and Mexico, I haven't been involved in Colorado, but this is where they fit in, because we're all in this room trying to get to an answer, and we've got to hear both sides, and very open to that. That's why I'm here, not here to, hear both sides.
Yeah, third side here. I just wanted to make sure in that step. So, Rick was saying, they need the ELGs so that they know they have that certainty, they know what they're aiming for. Just for us in the ELG program, we need to see that pilot data to establish those ELGs. So it's like a little circular and then it moves forward. So just putting that out there just to remind everybody.
I guess last comment on here, if I can have the last word. This is what I really liked about the Water Alliance petition, which was, Water Alliance. I don't know if Jennifer's still here. Matthias and Jennifer are heading that up, but they had taken kind of a staged approach of, and I think Texas is doing this as well, where it's like you're not going to go out and build the huge, ginormous one all at once. You've got to hit these milestones, and then that'll allow you to build bigger. You got to provide confidence, and so I think some of these other strategies that we're talking about can help get us there. But yeah, need to still figure it out. So thanks so much, Dan.
Thanks, appreciate it.